Ms. Wilson, we'll start with Mrs. Kusi, please. Go ahead.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you very much to our witnesses for being here today. Miigwech. I'm Stephanie Kusi, the Member of Parliament for Calgary-Midnapore. Coming from Calgary, I come from the land of Treaty 7 and Métis Region 3, so thank you very much for being here with us today. My first question, Madame Wilson, is why isn't the Minister of Indigenous Affairs here today? The committee unanimously agreed and to invite her to come. Why isn't she here today?
I didn't have an opportunity to have that discussion with her, so I'm not quite aware. You'd have to ask her. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. The AFN told this committee that they believe most of the contracts for the government's Indigenous procurement program have gone to shell companies. Do you believe that they are correct?
So I heard the testimony that was provided by the AFN Regional Chief Joanna Bernard, I believe, and I have a great deal of respect for her. We've actually reached out to AFN to try to corroborate some of the evidence and testimony they provided. We haven't quite received a response to the notion of shell companies and their numbers there, nor the 1%. So we'll continue to work with them, and hopefully they'll have more information for us.
Okay, so from your response, I'm sensing that you feel that perhaps their response, the information they provided this committee, requires further information from your department. Would that be the best summary of your response, would you say?
I would say that we do not have any evidence, at least from our perspective, as to the numbers that were provided. No evidence of the data points that were provided.
Okay, thank you very much. Do you conduct audits regarding compliance with Indigenous procurement rules?
We do indeed provide audits, and I might ask Jessica to speak to our pre-audit, post-audit, and random audit process.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. The procurement strategy for Indigenous business requires 3 specific types of audits. A pre-award audit, which is mandatory for contracts that are over $2 million and voluntary otherwise. Discretionary audit, which can be requested by either Indigenous Services Canada or the client or the contracting authority, and post-award audits, which are done at the request of the client or Indigenous Services Canada.
So then how many audits has the department conducted to this date, please?
So this year, I can confirm, well, since December 2023, we have completed 19 pre-award audits, and we have 12 post-award audits currently underway.
And could you please share with the committee on which companies did you conduct the audits, please?
The pre-award audits.
But which companies specifically would be listed under the pre-award audits?
If you can just give me a moment.
Certainly.
Please. Unfortunately, I don't have that list of which companies were done, but we could provide that if desired.
If you could please provide that to the committee, that would be much appreciated. I wanted to go now specifically to the ArriveCan issue and the abuse of joint ventures. Its relationship to Indigenous contracting. As I'm sure you're aware, Dalian is a 2-person company that qualified as Indigenous. It formed a partnership with Coradix, and that partnership was able to obtain contracts under the Indigenous procurement set-aside, even though Coradix has a substantial number of employees. And Dalian effectively has just the 2 partners. Dalian struggled to answer simple questions about the work they actually completed, and it would seem that Dalian is there to allow the non-Indigenous company Coradix to obtain opportunities meant specifically for Indigenous businesses, which, as I understand, is the objective of the program. In your opinion, do you see what happened in the case of ArriveCan as being an abuse of the program?
I don't have a personal opinion on that actual question. I'm following it like everyone else in terms of the audit, the Auditor General, and so.
Okay, so the department would this potentially be one of the current audits of the department?
Okay, got it. So we no longer have Dalian and joint venture companies with Dalian on the Indigenous Business Directory, nor do we have any contracts with Dalian or Coradix. They were suspended on March 12th from the Indigenous Business Directory due to questionable factors being raised in the media, here in committee sessions, and in fact, PSPC announced their suspension more broadly around the same time. That's.
Would you be able to indicate as to if Mr. David Yao was involved in the designing of the program itself?
We are not able to confirm whether that fact. I do understand that there was information provided by Mr. Yao. I can confirm, however, that when the PSAB, as it was known at the time, was put in place, there was extensive consultation with many stakeholders, and it's possible that Mr. Yao, as a business owner, could have been one of them.
Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you, Miigwech.
Very much. Mrs. Vignola.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Mr. Vaughn, Mr. Cohn, Ms. Wilson, Ms. Sultan, thank you. I'll leave you the moment to get your earpieces on. All good? All right. You just talked about compliance, and if there is no compliance, then it's a breach of contract. But what are the consequences for the contractor in the medium term also, not just on the spot, if there's a breach of contract?
Donc, nous avons quelques.
So there are a few different consequences. For example, as Jessica stated, an audit and the results of the audit, well, it's possible that the business will be removed.
Indigenous Business Directory. If there are more serious allegations, obviously those consequences can be brought to other levels of criminal activity. It's not something that we deal with quite frequently, but those would be some of the consequences.
Merci. Vous avez parlé.
Thank you. Earlier, you talked about some discussions underway regarding the directory being run by Indigenous organizations. Briefly, where are those discussions at?
So those discussions are occurring as part of something called the Transformative Indigenous Procurement Strategy, which is a 5-year strategy that started in 2021 to transform Indigenous procurement. The conversation has been ongoing since then, is why I bring that up. As my deputy has mentioned, they're going well, they're ongoing. We're at the point of being in discussions with figuring out I'll call it the nitty-gritty of how that would work. So the concept is there, the understanding of the need to transfer is there, and we're going through what we need to in order to be able to understand operationally how that would happen.
Thank you. Now, what I've been hearing since earlier today was that we can do an audit. It's possible to do an audit. I understand then that audits don't have to be conducted.
Audits are mandatory in certain situations and not mandatory in others. So, for example, it is mandatory to do a pre-award audit for contracts that are over $2 million. And the contracting authority or client could request to do one under $2 million.
Merci. Lorsque je regarde la liste et j'ai pris la peine.
Thank you. Now, when I look at the organizations, I mean, I haven't. Well, there's a list of all the businesses, Indigenous businesses used between April 1st of 2023 and March 31st, 2024, most of the contracts are very much under $2 million. So am I to understand that none of those contracts were audited? And also, how can we ensure that these businesses, one, exist, unless it's some kind of error in the French documents, but right away, I mean, I just have it in the English here, but the Ministerial Support Services Canada, that one is not in the directory, nor in the CCBA one or elsewhere. I don't know if there's a problem in the translation, lost in translation perhaps, but it doesn't seem to exist. How do you ensure, if most of the contracts are under $2 million, that these contracts are meeting the 51% requirements for ownership and 33% content criterion?
Before we get to the audits, so the pre and the post and the discretionary, there's a process that needs to happen for the business to be registered on the IBD. So we don't call that an audit, it's a verification of eligibility. And so it's in order for a business to be on the IBD, they need to provide proof of indigeneity, proof of the 51% ownership. We, in addition to checking that that's the case when we register a company the first time, we also regularly go through the IBD and perform that on a routine basis to ensure that the companies remain eligible. So that would be how we would be looking to make sure that the companies are eligible for contracts under $2 million. And with regard to ensuring the 33% compliance, it would be if a contract is awarded under PSIB, it needs to meet the 33% content requirement. Otherwise, it doesn't. If it was awarded under PSIB, it would contain terms and conditions in the contract that would require compliance to the 33%.
Justement, sur 33% de toutes les...
Now, of 33% of all the organizations that we see in the list, none have done a follow-up regarding subcontractors. You also mentioned it. I mean, how can you check then? How do we ensure that 33% of the content went to Indigenous peoples if nobody's checking?
A very quick response, please.
I actually apologize. I have to clarify the question.
Would you repeat it, Mrs. Vignola, please? And then a brief response.
Rapidement.
Quickly, none of the organizations that have given us a list of Indigenous businesses have done a follow-up of their subcontractors. None of them. So how do we ensure that these subcontractors, well, that 33% of the contractors make sure that 33% of them have done the work or have had the work done if nobody's done a follow-up?
Okay, so the source of my question comes from, I'm not understanding if you're saying that the businesses have told you that none of them have checked with the subcontractors. I'm sorry, I don't understand the question.
I'm afraid perhaps we can leave it for the next round. Very much. Mrs. Goodridge, welcome back to OGO.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. Thank you to our witnesses for being here today. I'm Layla Goodridge. I'm the Member of Parliament for Fort McMurray Cold Lake, so the home of Alberta's oil sands. It's worth noting that in 2019, oil sands did $2.4 billion in Indigenous procurement. So it is possible. So I'm going to go back. You mentioned that Dalian had been removed from the Indigenous business directory. Can you explain specifically why they were removed?
Again, it was due to some of the stories that came up in the media. It was a matter of questioning some of the reports that we were hearing from testimony. Interestingly enough, and I should add this, it was not because they were not eligible under the directory. In fact, they had demonstrated that they were eligible as an Indigenous business. So it was for other factors, questions that came up, particularly in testimony.
So just to clarify, the government still considers that they are an Indigenous business?
No, go ahead. We're not there.
So when we register, so I will answer the question.
Like just a simple yes or no would be like.
The business provided proof of indigeneity.
Okay, thanks. So my next question is, so you talked about how you don't monitor the subcontractors, so you don't really know, departments don't really know. Do you guys, or have you considered having a process in place to have an automatic audit if subcontracts are being utilized in any of these businesses?
I'd ask Jessica to chime in here, but there has not at this point in time been any consideration to increase tracking, monitoring, reporting, auditing. It
Okay,
can be
so-
considered. It can
So
be
coming from
considered.
the oil sands where large contracts happen on a regular basis, large contracts happen with Indigenous businesses, not because any government mandates them to do it, because it's just good business. Some of the best businesses in the oil sands field are Indigenous businesses. They don't get the contracts because they're Indigenous. They get the businesses because they are the best. It really aggravates me because there are processes and best practices in contracting that are readily available, and the fact that the government of Canada hasn't considered that potentially this is a loophole allowing non-Indigenous people to benefit from what is supposed to be an Indigenous procurement strategy really bothers me. So have you looked at best practices in contracting to ensure that subcontracts are being utilized properly?
Yes.
Okay, and so can you confidently say that it is Indigenous subcontracts that are getting those jobs?
I can confidently say that for the absolute clear, far outstanding majority, that is the case. There has been some discrepancies that have arrived because of some of the audits and the questions that have come up, but it would be for quite a minuscule number.
Okay, so how many businesses other than Dalian have been removed from the Indigenous business directory, either because they didn't qualify for some reason like Dalian, or you discovered that they weren't Indigenous?
Good question, Jess.
I can speak to, I don't have the answer for the entirety of time since the beginning of PSIB in 1995. I can tell you that, let's say if we take the past year, there have definitely been more than just Dalian that have been removed for various reasons.
Okay, so could you possibly get us a list of all of the businesses that have been removed? Let's take a date since 2015. And provide that in writing to the committee by Friday, of all the businesses that have been removed because they were either determined to not be Indigenous or that were removed because of other reasons. And to specify those reasons, could we have that by Friday, end of business day?
So we are able to provide that information, but doing it by the end of tomorrow is I would like to respectfully request more time.
Okay, what, like the 31st?
What's the usual timeline?
We have a short period of time that we're looking at this, so if we have 21 days, this might be outdated by the time we get to this. We should have this information so that we can continue. This is critical. I think it's actually shocking that we only found out today that Dalian was removed. I think Canadians would like to know some of this information.
Actually, that was in the Globe and Mail, but 31st is fine.
Okay. So,
That's pretty much our time.
okay, thank you.
We'll go over to Mr. Baines, but just to clarify, our committee has passed a motion. It's the maximum of 21 days. So earlier is always better for us. But we'll go to Mrs. Vignola, please. Go ahead.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. During their appearance, a witness had stated that there was no standardized certification process for checking status. So if a person from or a member of an Inuit, First Nation, or Métis Nation apply, there's no standardized way to check status. So is the government and the department looking at standardizing how to check status?
En fait, il y a un processus.
There is actually a very specific process for verifying status.
The evidence that we look at for registration is either Indian registration, citizenship with an Indigenous organization, all of these certified by Crown Indigenous Relations.
Permettez de préciser.
If you allow me to specify, the witness was stating that to show that we had Métis registration. One simply has to show that a grandparent was Métis, but there was a loss of status for second generation First Nations people under the Act, for example. So if I was a member of a First Nation, I think my grandson, I would think, would be a member of a First Nation, but that's not the case legally, and that would have an impact. Now, on that topic, the same witness was wondering, and I'm going to ask you to send the answer to me in writing over the next 3 weeks, please. In your directory, how many businesses are Inuit, how many are Métis, and how many are First Nation, and how many contracts each category of business has received or has been awarded? Please, in writing within the next 21 days. Thank you. And yes, we have some numbers here, and I'll let Jessica answer in a moment. But I just want to clarify one thing.
I want to talk about Crown Indigenous relations, CERNAC.
There's not much time. Would you be able to provide a brief response?
Yeah, it's going to be very brief. We go with their list. Jessica.
I can provide you with the number of the breakdown of First Nation, Métis, and Inuit businesses on the directory. We'll have to get back to you on the number of contracts. There are 1,966 First Nation businesses, 811 Métis businesses, and 162 Inuit businesses.
Thank you. Mrs. Block, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Earlier, Ms. Sultan, you testified that it is a minuscule number of contracts where businesses don't comply with the subcontracting requirements and that these are outliers. However, you have repeatedly stated that you don't track subcontractors, and we have seen this borne out throughout government departments as the documents they have submitted to this committee lack documentation on subcontractors. You even stated that the department was made aware of questionable factors in Dalian's case by media reports and testimony at this committee. This implies that your department took no initiative in the case of Dalian to ensure they were meeting their requirements. So my question is, how are you able to testify today that the vast majority of contracts comply with the subcontracting requirement when your department does not monitor subcontracts and other departments have made it clear that they do not monitor subcontracts either?
I would say that monitoring does occur. Tracking does occur. It is not done by our little unit at ISK. It is done by departments that are all across the country, all across town, that have that ability. You are right, we do not track subcontracts. I understand that some may want an entity like PSPC or ISK or some central organization to track and monitor, continuously audit, the three, whatever number of contracts there are, almost 3,000, and thousands of these running each day. So I don't know. If your study recommends we do more tracking, monitoring, auditing, we will certainly consider this, but we will also advise you of the cost of that, and we'll advise the government of the cost of that, because it would require hiring several more auditing firms, many of those non-Indigenous, I would add. I would love to tell you, however, about a better alternative of what we think is an option going forward, which is Indigenous participation plans.
So I just want to go back to the comment that you made about there being a minuscule number of companies that are not complying with the subcontracting rules or with the rules to ensure that they are subcontracting to Indigenous businesses. Where are you getting that information from?
I'm getting the information from the number of audits that we've been requested to do by departments. That's essentially, and those numbers have been very low. I believe Indigenous businesses, for the most part, are honest business people. I believe that my departmental counterparts and procurement officers who do their public service are generally trying to do their job.
Thank you for that. I am glad that you have mentioned that the department conducts audits of its own. Could you please table with the committee a copy of all audits and the associated reports by your department from January 2021 to present?
I think we'll have to square that circle with the previous request from a member who asked for the same, pretty much the same thing.
I believe she asked for a list. I'm asking for the audits.
You're asking for the audits. I will definitely get some advice on that as to what is releasable publicly or to the committee. So if you can allow me to do that, I'm happy to provide and be as transparent as possible. I do need to consider privacy implications and access to information rules.
Well, on that note, Mr. Chair, could you perhaps provide us with some advice and provide Ms. Sultan with some advice as to what is releasable to a committee?
Basically, if the committee asks for it, you have to provide everything that the committee calls for. So if the committee asks for the audit, you can ask us to hang on to it, to not release it, or you can just send it to us. The committee does have the right to ask for those items. Okay. If you want to get back to us, perhaps in writing Monday, with what you'd like to do, we'd probably be fine with that.
That would be hugely appreciated. I would say,
think in this
though,
case, the audits with perhaps personal information taken out.
That would be more comfortable for me, for sure. I would say, though, that some of the audits that we have are still underway. So they're not completed. I think it's fair.
I think we're just looking for completed audits.
Just completed. Okay. Thank you.
Right. You've got about 20 seconds left.
Okay. Thank you very much.
We'll now go back to Mrs. Goodrich.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So as someone, again, that comes from Northern Alberta, I would argue that many of the businesses, and I've had many Indigenous businesses actually come to me saying that they are on the directory or they're struggling to get on the directory, but they can't actually get the government contracts. They're able to get billion-dollar contracts in oil sands and have for sometimes in excess of 20, 40 years, but they can't get Government of Canada contracts. No matter what they do, they're having to hire consultants just to be able to navigate because the federal system has become so complicated. And these are very intelligent, very successful businesses. And so my frustration sits here going, the Government of Canada has failed at this of actually being able to operationalize it. And you sit there going, you don't try and get all the businesses onto the directory because maybe they're in the oil sands and they don't want to be. I would argue with you that all Indigenous businesses should be tried to get on that list, because that prevents them from getting on other lists. And so in a question, you've stated about the Métis, you'd go to the Métis Nation of Alberta. What would happen in the case of Northern Alberta Métis that have officially disassociated from the Métis Nation of Alberta? Do they no longer become eligible to be on the Indigenous business list?
So as I mentioned earlier, the list that we draw upon is from CERNAC. It is the recognized Indigenous bodies that are recognized by the CERNAC ministry. And so we go to them. We don't decide that on our own. So if the organization that you have identified is on the CERNAC list, it remains on the Indigenous Business Directory. I would just go back to your earlier point. I agree. It's sometimes a very complicated process. I've heard that as well. The more we can streamline, the better. But actually where we want to go is we want to transfer the Indigenous Business Directory to Indigenous organizations and Indigenous, we can improve what we have now, but our sole objective and our primary objective is to transfer and have Indigenous peoples lead that.
Just to go back to the Dalian, you've determined it did meet the qualifications as being Indigenous, but it didn't meet. You decided to remove it for other reasons. What specific reason was it removed?
It's, yeah, my understanding. So that, yes, you're right. They were originally recognized by the First Nation leadership as a member of their nation, but a non-status member. But regardless, they're eligible to be on the directory. It came to, we noted in the Globe and Mail that interviews with Dalian, he had referred to changes in his corporation. So that affected this 51% owned and controlled scenario. So that was part of the reason why we had to remove him from his business from the directory. It's no longer, he changed his corporation structure. So,
Okay, so if a business is determined to not be Indigenous or not qualify for some reason, is there any effort made to try and recover the funds that they might have received in Indigenous procurement?
That is one of the options that could certainly be pursued by the Government of Canada.
Has it been pursued by the Government of Canada?
Not to our knowledge. I'm not in a position to speak for the entire Government of Canada.
Okay, so has efforts been made to go specifically after Dalian to recover those funds? Can you repeat? The mic wasn't on.
No.
So no effort has been made by the Government of Canada or ISC to recover funds from Dalian?
I don't know about the Government of Canada.
Okay.
But in ISC, no.
Do you think that that's a responsible decision?
There are numerous considerations ongoing with regard to the Dalian and Karatics and what we heard in committee and in the media. So the totality of the actions that the government could choose to take aren't complete because work is still ongoing.
I appreciate that. Canadians expect that their tax dollars are going to be spent appropriately and fairly, and in cases when they aren't, they expect that government is going to do what is being done. What is being considered when it comes to the case of Dalian specifically?
I don't want to refer the question, but there are other entities that are looking at this beyond ISC. So we're one player. Some of those decisions require more than one department to come together, and so I wouldn't want to speak for them.
Back to Mrs. Vignola.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. So, as I stated earlier, we received lists of each organization in each department with, how many contracts they were awarded for how much and so on. We received all that, and now I looked at everything, and I'm trying to go through and see if there were any mistakes made in the lists. Are there businesses that shouldn't be there because they are not Indigenous and so on? I'm using your directory, but also other different directories from the First Nations themselves. This is my question. What explains the fact that on your directory I'll find a business, but that I won't find it anywhere else?
I think the simplest answer to that question is that the business can choose to register where they wish. So if the business chooses to register on the IBD and not any other list, that would be their choice.
Également,
Also, by looking through your directory, I saw that, and perhaps it's the teacher in me because it's something, work methodology is something I taught, but I saw that there are some files where the files clearly indicate when the business was created, others where that information is not there. In some cases, we see the number of employees. In other cases, we don't see that number, and there are no files that show which criteria are used to see whether that business qualifies and so on. I'm trying to analyze all of these elements. So what explains that?
Thank you for that question. That's I understand completely what you're saying. I would have to go back and take I'd have to go back and take a look because there's all those fields that are available, but you're right, they're not populated for every business in the same way. So with regard to your specific example about the number of employees, I expect that that's probably a holdover or the result of the fact that we did used to require a specific number of employees. So we can go through, but there's not a specific reason that I can state to you that that is the case, and that's something that I will take a look at to ensure more conformity.
Thank you very much. Back to you, Mrs. Block.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Khan, there has been some contrasting testimony around Dalian today. You stated that Dalian changed their corporate structure, which meant they ran afoul of the 51% Indigenous-owned requirement. But Ms. Wilson stated earlier that Dalian was still considered an Indigenous business and would still be on the list. So is Dalian still considered an Indigenous business despite not being 51% Indigenous owned? And can you provide the committee with a list of other criteria that would cause a business to be removed from the list?
They are removed from the list. They're no longer part of the list. As we indicated earlier, they're still part of an ongoing audit, both for Dalian and Cordex. So we'll see what that outcome is all about. It's possible that they're in violation of the policy itself overall. We don't know until the audit is completed. But they are not on the list. We removed them from the list because of the change in governance of that company, and they don't meet the eligible criteria for PSIP.
Okay, well,
I'll supplement
again submit that that is very different from what we heard earlier. But can you please provide the committee with the list of other criteria that would cause a committee to be removed from the list?
Yes.
Sorry, Mr. Khan has responded yes.
Yes, we will do that in writing.
Okay, I'm sorry. I did not hear that response. Ms. Wilson, you have been the Deputy Minister for over 2 years at Indigenous Services Canada, and you have mentioned in this meeting that you have only just started to reach out to Indigenous groups for their help in verifying businesses on the list. Could you please tell the committee why it took you this long to reach out to Indigenous groups to have them involved in the verification process? And can you also tell us what role Indigenous groups will be playing in the verification process?
Okay. Yes, I have been at Indigenous Services Canada for 2 years, but actually the process that we're discussing and that you have referenced was underway 2 years before. So we're in fact 4 years into this discussion with Indigenous partners. Is this, you're nodding no? That's not?
I'm not nodding no. I'm just reflecting back on the testimony you provided earlier in this meeting. So thank you for that clarification. And I guess I would ask that you then answer the second question about what role Indigenous groups will be playing in this process.
Go ahead, Jessica, talk about the process. Okay, I'm just going to ask Jessica to once again explain some of the discussions and the reforms underway that we're talking about under the Transformative Indigenous Procurement Strategy.
Thank you, Deputy. So the the goal is to transfer the Indigenous Business Directory to Indigenous peoples. And so in that scenario, it would be Indigenous peoples that would be verifying Indigenous businesses.
Great, thank you very much.